Good morning in the United States and good afternoon in Europe. My name is Kristine Berzina. I'm a senior fellow for U.S. Defense and Transatlantic Security in the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on the global implications of the U.S. National Defense Strategy. It has been a winter of unexpected surprises in the transatlantic defense relationship. We had the launch of a national security strategy in early December, followed by a series of activities in Greenland or around Greenland, in Venezuela, Latin America, discussions over Iran, and now another policy document to discuss, the National Defense Strategy. It has been challenging to try to understand what the direction is of U.S. security and defense policy. What is something that is going to result in meaningful impacts in various regions? And what is political rhetoric? We want to help you understand the different nuances here. For many of our European allies and our European audiences, the National Defense Strategy came with a few top lines that could be alarming, surprising. The pronouncement of a critical but more limited support from the United States to Europe is something that has dominated headlines. But that's not the only thing that really Europeans should be paying attention to, or transatlanticists should be paying attention to in the National Defense Strategy. So to break this down and to understand what are the elements of this new important policy document, what should be the top lines for a deeper understanding, we put together an excellent panel of experts from across GMF. Today we have with us Dr. Carrie Lee. Carrie is the Senior Fellow for Strategic Democracy Initiatives based in our DC office. We also have joining us Sophie Arts. Sophie is a Fellow for Security and Defense, focused on the Arctic, North America, and Northern Europe. And finally, we have Kate Stotesbery, who is Managing Director for Government Relations, also in our DC office. We're going to start by looking first at the wide array of things that the National Defense Strategy pronounces, and then go into particular regional, and then zooming out to wider U.S. policy implications of this strategy. And to kick us off on this bigger question of what this National Defense Strategy is and how it is a departure from what we have seen in previous strategies, I'm going to go to Carrie. What, Carrie, is going to be so different, and what is so different about this particular National Defense Strategy that we haven't seen in the previous one for Biden or even Trump 1?
So good morning, everyone. I apologize about my voice. I'm just getting over a little bit of illness, so I hope you bear with me. I think as written, the National Defense Strategy represents one of the most significant departures in the transatlantic defense relationship, and really in U.S. defense priorities and postures that we've seen since the Second World War. It's a massive shift from an outward-focused United States that really sees itself as a global leader to one that is far more concerned with low intensity and asymmetric conflict in the Western Hemisphere, the blurring of the lines between policing operations and military operations in the Western Hemisphere, and one that really places a strong emphasis on burden sharing with allies in a way that we just haven't seen before, where the U.S. was much more comfortable taking the lead and accepting perhaps some free ridership in exchange for its leadership and agenda-setting role. So these are major departures as a kind of worldview and strategy that are in line with the national security strategy that was released in early December of last year, but nevertheless mark a significant change from 75 years of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II.
Thank you, Carrie. So philosophically, this is a tremendous shift. This is a telegraphing of different directions, of different priorities. Sophie, turning to you, the transatlantic allies have been shaken in recent weeks by the crisis over Greenland, which has just recently slightly settled down. But the National Defense Strategy gives us insights into what exactly is the priority in the Western Hemisphere. And given that so many in the transatlantic space have been so concerned over what Greenland means, how does the strategy look at Greenland? How does it look at the Arctic? What should Europeans be taking from this?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kristine, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's joining. So as Carrie just highlighted so succinctly, the National Defense Strategy really looks at the Western Hemisphere as kind of a U.S. sphere of influence and neighboring countries essentially as its backyard, which it wants to keep free of foreign influence, especially from China, which the strategy casts as essentially the primary challenge or threat, or at least the first listed challenge in the strategy. And so in this hemisphere, the U.S. is really adamant to protect its U.S. interests. In a way, I think this is a little bit reminiscent of the way essentially that Russia has cast its neighborhood and near abroad, in essence, to create a buffer against NATO. And this is very aligned, I think, with the National Defense Strategy saying that it doesn't seek to solve all the world's problems, but really wants to focus on the most immediate threat to Americans, as Carrie has also highlighted. And that includes protecting maritime and air approaches, including in the Arctic, and having full maritime and military access to important sea lanes and key terrain. And the Trump administration sees Greenland as very much part of that. I think we've seen that play out and emphasized in recent weeks and months through statements. But the National Defense Strategy really clearly articulates this again. Unlike the National Security Strategy, which didn't make this explicit, but also, of course, very much emphasized the Western Hemisphere broadly. But the National Defense Strategy refers directly to Greenland, essentially in the same breath as it refers to the Panama Canal and what it calls the Gulf of America. So this is clearly outlined, articulated, and confirms kind of the framing that we've seen play out over recent months. And as Carrie highlighted, so we essentially see a high prioritization of homeland defense over forward posture, not to the total exclusion, but definitely a huge shift in terms of focus, and a focus on developing denial capabilities from the homeland over deterrence. So denial of missiles, including nuclear missiles, denial of unmanned aerial threats, of cyber threats, electronic warfare threats. And the United States or the Trump administration wants to do that via its ambitious layered missile defense architecture that the administration is working to develop, which is, of course, Golden Dome. And the National Defense Strategy and generally the Trump administration over recent weeks and months have really indicated that they see both Canada and Greenland as an important part of that, to really protect against threats from the north that would be coming over the pole, essentially, so via the Arctic. And these would be threats as outlined in the strategy from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, potentially. And so this builds on an important role that both Canada and Greenland already play when it comes to missile warning and general situational awareness. So, of course, Canada's North Warning System, which is part of NORAD, and the Pitufik space base in Greenland already play an important part in situational awareness and missile warning. But the administration now wants to take this one step further to really focus on missile defense, which would be a change. So currently, neither Canada nor Greenland participate in missile defense. And Canada has been against joining this effort in the past for many reasons, including questions of strategic stability. But the Trump administration has expressed hopes that they will join into the Golden Dome effort, so we'll have to see how that evolves. And of course, I think it's important to note, as most people watching this, probably all will have noted, that Greenland has been very adamant and backed by Denmark and its NATO allies, saying that it does not want to be part of the United States and that it rejects the pressure and threats from the Trump administration. And I think it's also important to note again that there's no indication that there are any immediate threats from Russia or China towards Greenland. But of course, Greenland or the Pituffik Space Base, as mentioned, does play an important role when it comes to missile warning and potential intercontinental threats that would be passing over Greenland. But as far as I can see, there's no clear logic that supports President Trump's position that the US needs to own Greenland to achieve any of its interests, including even Golden Dome actualization, especially because one of the key and kind of game-changing components envisioned under Golden Dome are actually space-based components, and that would target missiles in the boost phase, so would be targeted over aggressor territory, so they wouldn't necessarily need to be ground-based interceptors. I'll leave it at that, but happy to talk more about Golden Dome later on.
Thank you so much. And I think we'll get to that technological aspect. And after we do this first round of visions and comments, we will be taking questions. So as you already have questions in response to Carrie, Sophie, and Kate, please do type them in, and I will call on them and ask them as we move to the second part of this webinar. But I think, thank you, Sophie, for that look at the Arctic and at Greenland. And I think it's interesting also to Carrie's point that the homeland and Western Hemisphere are put in one breath. Those in the reprioritization of the National Defense Strategy. It isn't that it's homeland, Western Hemisphere, China, etc., but the notion, the vision of what homeland is and what Western Hemisphere is integrated, which is something that I think is really important for our partners and allies to understand, that this is not, that this is a different approach to what is home and what is abroad. Kate, you sit in DC, you're on the Hill all the time, you're heading our engagements, in particular with Congress. And so you're perfectly positioned to be looking at what is happening on the Trump administration's documents, looking at the National Defense Strategy, and seeing how that interacts with what Congress has been pronouncing and shaping as policy. When you look at the NDS, how does that compare to congressional priorities? Well, how will Congress see this National Defense Strategy?
Thank you, Kristine, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining. It's a great question. So this Congress, I would say, through the carefully, or some might say painstakingly, negotiated National Defense Authorization Act, which is now law, as well as through bipartisan leaders' statements, really approaches U.S. defense policy with a completely distinct worldview from that which we see in the National Defense Strategy. Congress does seek to resource the administration to do a lot of the things that are outlined in the National Defense Strategy, that it indicates our priorities, and I'll get to those details soon. But it very distinctly tasks the administration to not cede American leadership and to maintain U.S. leadership in a multipolar world, specifically via its defense strategy. Congress does not want the use of the U.S. military to be ceding sort of an ounce of that leadership. So I would say that priorities differ, but far less apart than how different the philosophies are. Really, their to-do lists do overlap quite a lot, which is an interesting piece of this. But the heart, the vision, the intent of this document compared to that which we see from congressional leadership in the committees of jurisdiction and on a bipartisan basis really do chart different courses for these distinct branches of government. So again, they're not in Congress, but they're different. I would say that the administration's philosophy from this National Defense Strategy is, as you said, homeland first. It's skeptical of the value of military alliances. It rejects a duty to uphold the international order, which was compared to cloud castles in the sky, and it really fears entanglements abroad. Congress, on the other hand, the Senate Armed Services Committee, in their preface to the National Defense Authorization Act, final text, recognizes an axis of aggressors comprised of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and notes that they operate across multiple theaters and that their objective is to dismantle American influence. And Congress fairly specifically seeks to resource the administration to provide them the tools needed in order to meet this challenge and to uphold American leadership and priorities abroad. And part of that is modernizing and reindustrializing, which is a theme that you see throughout the National Defense Strategy as well. So I would say on the similarities front, you do see that modernization, that reindustrialization, that push towards efficiency, and you do see a bolstering in support for resources in the Western Hemisphere and homeland security. You do see a focus on the Indo-Pacific, although Congress does not seek a goal of a decent peace. It's a different kind of deterrence, and both, of course, would like to see Europe and different partners step up into fuller partnerships and do not seek dependencies. But the aim is really different. I do think that for congressional leaders that authored the National Defense Authorization Act and others, the goal is a stronger alliance. And for the National Defense Strategy authors, that will be debated. We'll be parsing that, and I leave that to my colleagues. But it does seem to be lessening U.S. responsibility in Europe. So really, one thing to note is that the National Defense Authorization Act, from the Hill's perspective, laid down a marker to the Department of Defense that it needed to engage with the Hill further on their policy changes, especially with regard to Europe and to Ukraine. But again, resources and provides them many tools in order to sort of meet this moment as they define it. The national security strategy really sharply diverged from all of this that's articulated on those points. And then the NDS, really seems to try to hold to Trump's ethos on all of these, but really square all of these internal voices. But it doesn't necessarily reflect that Capitol Hill is being further consulted in these policy changes, and specifically those points in the National Defense Authorization Act which prohibit U.S. troops from being withdrawn from Europe without proper consultation, certification that it's in U.S. national security interest. That could come to a head if there was a move to actually move those troops. So I would say that with the national security strategy, Congress's message was really watch what we do, including through the National Defense Authorization Act, through other means, not just what we say through these policy documents. That's become a more difficult environment since Venezuela and Greenland, really arguably have been a strategy put into practice. And with the national defense strategy, I think we will see a little bit more complicated messaging from Congress.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I think that many of our participants might also want to ask further questions, because U.S. foreign policy is not a monolith. And sitting here in Washington, you do see the different priorities and the struggle for the future of U.S. security and defense policy. So, Carrie, I want to come back to you on that, on where the rubber hits the road. How do you think that the Pentagon is going to implement the National Defense Strategy? The way it reads, it's different from the National Security Strategy. This isn't a values-based deep dive into the way that other regions conduct their domestic policy. It doesn't have that level of emotional insult, perhaps, for the Europeans in the way that the National Security Strategy did. And yet it has very hard truths, very blunt language, very high expectations of change that would potentially really alter America's presence in the world. How will that work? Do you think it will be implemented as written?
So I think the short answer is I don't know, Kristine. As written, right, the National Defense Strategy requires massive changes to U.S. defense posture, to U.S. training, manning, equipping. Western Hemisphere operations look very different than traditional operations in the European theater, and the types of military operations, joint large scale combat operations, or LISCO, that the Pentagon has been preparing for since the Obama administration and the pivot to Europe. So since pivot to Asia, I'm sorry. So really since the Obama administration, but this kicks into high gear under the first Trump administration with the 2017 National Defense Strategy that was shepherded by then Secretary of Defense James Mattis. The Pentagon has been moving full speed ahead with enthusiasm for large scale combat operations in Europe and the Pacific, in order to deter threats by Russia in the European theater and China in the Indo-Pacific. This was previous strategies, therefore, were ones that the Pentagon was quite excited about. It allowed them to sort of move on from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which never sat comfortably with Pentagon identity and culture and U.S. military sort of operational preferences. There were those like me who were somewhat critical of that, saying that the Pentagon was too eager to move on rather than learning the lessons of Afghanistan, right? And thinking through what does low intensity conflict continue to look like. But nevertheless, right, this was an enthusiastic shift by the Pentagon that occurred over the course of probably about 15 years. And now we have a national defense strategy that says, hold up, yeah, we understand that, but the characterization of the threat in Europe, Russia as a persistent but manageable threat that Europe can take care of, the characterization of the Chinese threat as one that relies primarily and revolves primarily on economics and shipping rather than military threats to US partners and allies, rather than threats to systems of government like democracy, right? Democracy is nowhere in the national defense strategy. These are really significant shifts that are going to be very unpopular and have already proved to be very unpopular inside the Pentagon. Observers will recall that in the lead up to the revelations of the national security strategy and the release of a lot of these documents, there were a lot of leaks about what the national defense strategy was going to entail, as they kind of like red flares coming out of the Pentagon from the Joint Staff. And it was like kind of widely understood that these leaks were coming from either the chairman's office or other corners of the Joint Staff, trying to say, like, this is a problem for what the Pentagon has been preparing for 15 years. So, as written, the National Defense Strategy, and I saw this analysis and it resonated with me, is not a $1.5 trillion strategy, right? The National Defense Strategy is maybe a $500 billion strategy, as written, with a lot of that going into special operations, training for policing Western Hemisphere, and some research and development around Golden Dome, missile defense, maybe some modernization. But the reliance on burden sharing and allies really significantly reduces the potential cost of the strategy. And yet, the president and the Pentagon are pushing for a $1.5 trillion budget. So there's some real contradictions here between what the strategy outlines and what the U.S. military should be paying attention to, should be focusing its training missions on, should be the kinds of capabilities it should be investing in, versus what it actually plans to do. So I will end your very insightful question with an old adage that we used to say when I worked at the Army War College, and that is really popular inside the Pentagon: show me your budget and I'll show you your strategy. Whatever the policy documents say, I will be very interested in how the next couple rounds of authorizations and appropriations go, and where exactly the Pentagon thinks it needs to be spending money. And that's going to tell me a lot about what the focus of the Pentagon is and whether this strategy is simply rhetoric and window dressing for those who are interested in Western Hemisphere operations, or whether this truly is going to mark a profound shift, the kind of profound shift that the language in the NDS lays.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And I think that this question of the implications of transformation of the actual American presence is incredibly important for all of the allies. GMF, of course, and in this conversation, we're framing a lot of this in the context of Europe and the more challenging relationship with Europe in this past year. And yet, of course, also in the Indo-Pacific, it has these transformational impacts if the United States is going to be relying more on allies than permitting allies to be relying on the United States. Sophie, though, in terms of what would come next, I want to come back to you a bit on the Golden Dome, because when you read the strategy, it seeks to very elegantly carve up the world, where Europeans look at Russia and the Indo-Pacific allies are looking more at China, and the United States is looking more at it. And oh, by the way, we actually do need to build a Golden Dome because we have all of these other threats. And so if Russia or China were entirely manageable by the allies, maybe we wouldn't be seeking such a new missile defense system. And I feel like some of these pan-theater questions get a little bit hidden or not addressed directly in this strategy. But if there is this new push to have a Golden Dome, if there is a desire to change the missile defense in the North, what would be the role of allies in that? Is that clear? Is this something that the U.S. wants to do by itself? What would be the European role in the Arctic or in this new technological element of the strategy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristine. I think as Carrie highlighted, we have to differentiate a little bit about what the strategy says and what we actually think is going to happen. And, some of that is of course speculation. But I think the strategy, as it's been discussed, the Pentagon has kind of framed it as deliberately ambiguous to not give away too much, has alluded to the fact that apparently the classified version is less ambiguous. So I think we shouldn't over analyze what the strategy says to really understand future actions, although it's of course important to pay attention and we'll see how it moves forward. But I think specifically with regard to Golden Dome, so as you emphasized, I think the strategy really emphasizes these different regions of the world, right? With the Western Hemisphere being the primary region that the U.S. really feels like it needs to protect and step up its capacity, and then the European Europe essentially as its own region. But of course, as you point out, and as is highlighted also by Golden Dome, all of these are facing the same threats, right? Golden Dome is designed to deter threats from Russia, China, the other adversaries that are outlined in the strategy. And of course, that's also what allies are helping to deter and defend against. So specifically with regard to Golden Dome, we've seen the Trump administration point to Canada's and Greenland's role of essentially outline the hope that Canada with pressure, I would say, that Canada and Greenland would support and join into the Golden Dome effort. And then I think there's a different role to play for the European allies in the European Arctic. And of course, this European allies have played a critical role when it comes to defending and deterring against Russia. And this is not only a role of defending Europe against Russia, even though that's also an important role, because Nordic allies are very important when it comes to situational awareness and defense with regard to potential Russian submarine movements through the GI-UK gap. So very important to the defense of Europe, but also very important to the defense and missile warning of the United States and the North American continent. And so I think it's difficult to fully differentiate it. It's not fully clear from the strategy what the role of European allies would be. I think there's mixed messages in the strategy, right? Like it talks a lot about model allies, which are those that are spending a lot, have high capacity, ideally also contributing to the US defense industrial base and defense industrial base revitalization. Well, the Nordic allies are doing exactly that, and so is Canada. So in many ways, that suggests that there will be continuous strong collaboration, which I think would be very much in the interest of the United States, because you really can't disintegrate these theaters, even though they are distinct. They're really closely connected. And I think this is something that the Biden administration strategy documents highlighted a lot with their framing of integrated deterrence, which is a term that has been criticized as well during its time because no one really knew what it meant, but essentially emphasizing that that really the U.S. needs to work with allies and partners, and specifically in the Arctic context, that it has no other option. I mean, the U.S. has very limited capacity and capabilities in the Arctic, and it really relies on its allies, especially the European allies, when it comes to posturing capabilities. And so I think it would be very much in the U.S. interest to continue and deepen that collaboration. And so I hope that's what we'll see. And I think it's encouraging to hear the discussions around potentially have NATO having a greater role in a situational awareness mission in the Arctic that have been discussed recently, also in the after President Trump's visit to the World Economic Forum and in Davos, and discussions with the Secretary General of NATO. So we'll have to see how that evolves. But I think there's definitely differences in how the Trump administration perceives the role of North American allies versus European allies. But in the end, I think it's important to not separate those too much, because the interests and mechanisms are really, really deeply interconnected.
And quickly, we have a question that follows so closely on this, which is there's this potential for cooperation and the need for new ground-based infrastructure in Greenland for the Golden Dome. Does this is this prioritization? Is this the need for this in any way undermined by the pivot to China? Like, will these coexist? Both the prioritization of Golden Dome and the cooperation essential for that, and a pivot to China for trade deals.
Is this a question for me or?
Yes, sorry. Yes, Sophie. Yes.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I think they will coexist. I mean, I think with Golden Dome, not that much is known about Golden Dome. Golden Dome is very much a visionary, future-oriented project. I think there's a lot of aspects that are compiled under the Golden Dome umbrella, which are actually pre-existing efforts when it comes to missile warning and defense. But then there's also the more visionary new technologies that would be integrated in this that are not really on the horizon right now, and would take longer to develop and would also require a lot more resourcing. And so I think we'll have to see how that plays out, since President Trump has indicated in the past that he thinks we'll see Golden Dome actualized by 2028. I think there's a lot of questions around that. I think that there's been some discussions that would maybe be some initial testing, but certainly not a completed architecture. And so I think we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think the strategy really highlighted as well the importance of the Indo-Pacific region to the Trump administration and its interest in maintaining the capacity to operate there from a position of strength, as they indicate. So yes, I would say they're parallel efforts, but we'll have to see. Specifically with regard to Golden Dome, we'll have to see how it all plays out.
Thank you, Sophie. Kate, I want to come to you and also pull in Carrie because we have questions about the domestic elements of the national defense strategy. So for Kate, the situation in Minneapolis is getting a lot of attention from the full country as well as global partners. How does this dimension of domestic policy and also of the ongoing funding debates in the Hill affect the national security, national defense policies? Are they connected in this particular situation? Are the domestic pieces taking away congressional attention from the international? Are they two sides of the same coin? I think it's becoming ever more challenging to navigate what do we mean by U.S. military power? What is military power? And how do you see Congress trying to understand this and respond to this?
It's a tricky point because I think this is normally the point in the conversation with other U.S. domestic political focus points where I would remind kind of all of us that work on foreign and security policy that U.S. politics are driven by domestic political forces, and that what is on the mind of U.S. citizens are these domestic politics, and that really the tripwires for foreign policy are forever wars, a few other specific places, but otherwise, they move in different spheres. I think this is a very interesting case and maybe the beginning of something that we'll see more and more, because it's this administration that has really pulled this kind of domestic action into the sphere of foreign and security policy, this defense of the homeland idea and this articulation that what's happening in Minneapolis is part of that defense of the homeland. And then, in the national defense strategy, articulating that that's the priority over defending ideals abroad or some kinds of military alliances, pulls this into one area in a way that it normally wouldn't. We would normally see these as separate. So I do think it's fair to say that there is a perception, there's a changing question of whether or not the idea of defense of the homeland has changed. Many citizens may wonder, is this what folks are seeing in Minneapolis, the vision of homeland security that is now the priority also for our U.S. foreign and security policy? I think one criticism from Capitol Hill with the national security strategy was that this was its authors pulling their domestic policies into the foreign policy sphere. And I think the national defense strategy and ICE operations in Minneapolis sort of arguably pulls foreign defense policy into the domestic policy sphere. What are actions by federal forces engaging with U.S. citizen protesters, which normally we think of very much within a domestic sphere, have been positioned as homeland defense. So I think that's an open question, whether this is now all part of defense of the homeland, the use of these agents as part and parcel of kind of the military focus. I think we could see a lot more engagement and political mobilization for citizens around this question. And then, of course, it's playing in very much, as you said, to the current debate in Congress. The funding deadline, I'll just remind everyone, is on Friday for Congress to pass a package of funding bills for many parts of the government in order for it to stay fully open. And one of those bills, actually, which is not commanding headlines, is the Department of Defense appropriations or Department of War, depending on which member of Congress you're talking to. And specifically, of course, the DHS, Department of Homeland Security appropriations point is the major flashpoint after the situation in Minneapolis over the weekend. And Senate Democrats seem to be close to an agreement with the White House on how to move forward. I think the question mark is really the House. Happy to get into that a little bit more, where we might see a situation of a partial government shutdown over the weekend until the House returns. And then if everything moves smoothly, then the House voting to advance this. But the House is still a bit of a variable here. I think there's widespread opposition to funding DHS in its current form at these levels. And I think it's an open question as to whether, folks domestically connect some of the political dots also to defense policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. And I think this also is an example of the plurality of actors in American policy and this question of where power sits, because so often I hear from European allies and partners the question of, well, who is stepping up, and are there multiple voices in policy? So do you see this as an example of a more empowered and more vocal Congress? Kate?
Yes, in short. I think this is one of the places where you've seen Congress function in a way where those who are usually very close allies of the president, and will continue to be so, but who don't normally speak out, are speaking out. And I think it's both, them doing so in private and to shift the position of their caucus, but also in response to earnest, widespread citizen sentiment. So I think this is Congress kind of functioning as we're used to seeing it, but not as a custom in the past few years, where some of that citizen sentiment has been maybe not always reflected.
Thank you. Carrie, back to you on this, on the question of these domestic powers. We have a question from the audience on policing and military operations. Is the NDS a blueprint for domestic deployments of the military? How do you see that dimension of the NDS and what we could see coming forward from the Pentagon?
So I'm going to be less politic than Kate about the domestic deployments. Although I will say that I draw a pretty bright line between DHS and the activities of the Department of Homeland Security, federal law enforcement agencies, versus the use of the military and the National Guard. And I think these are really important distinctions that perhaps sometimes get lost on our European and our international audiences. That being said, since taking office, the Trump administration has been very clear that they intend to use the military and military forces, whether they are federalized National Guard or active duty Marines, or they put the 11th Airborne on standby for Minnesota. So whether it's active duty or National Guard, reserves, wherever, they see combating domestic protests, supporting immigration operations, fighting crime, and other tasks that have traditionally been done by civilian law enforcement here in the United States as fair game for military use of force. That is highly significant in the U.S. domestic context. It is also probably the way that the administration achieves its real pivot to Western Hemisphere and domestic operations is through these sort of forcible deployments, because we live in a world of finite resources. So the Congressional Budget Office just came out with an estimate that said that the domestic deployments over the 2025 to Los Angeles using the National Guard, the Marines, to Portland, to Washington, D.C., to all of these others under either Title 10 or Title 32 authorities, so where the federal government is paying, totaled about $500 million. That's $500 million that had to come from somewhere else. And as you read in a lot of the legal briefs that were filed, that was also time and training and resources that were taken away from other missions that the Marines and the National Guard forces inside the United States were preparing for, whether it was natural disaster relief or large scale combat operations in the Indo-Pacific. So, simply by confusing, right, what is civilian policing inside the United States with what it is an appropriate mission for the United States military, which has traditionally been much more outward facing and sees its own identity, not as one responsible for policing or waging force against the American people, right? Or to quote the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, using American, or actually it was the president who said it in Quantico, using American cities as training grounds, right? This is one way in which, U.S. defense priorities are going to necessarily have to shift. To date, I think the Army in particular, but also the Air Force have tried to manage the administration's focus on the Western Hemisphere by keeping it to thinking about operations around drug trafficking, so-called narco terrorists, et cetera, through, changes to the Northcom mission. The Army set up AmeriCom at the now renamed Fort Bragg. What is old is new again. And so they've been trying to sort of shape this to be more in line with how the military has thought about its mission. The administration keeps sending it back to domestic operations, whether it's deportation operations or beautification projects in Washington, D.C., or, supporting immigration enforcement in Los Angeles. So I think, to sort of summarize here, I think the questioner is exactly right in thinking about this blurring of the lines as taking time and training by necessity away from other missions. The final point that I would add is that a lot of the discussion around domestic policing focuses on the United States National Guard, which over the last 25 years of combat and the post 9/11 wars has very much turned into an operational reserve for the United States military. So the vast majority, based on the structure of the military that was laid out in 1973 with what we call the Abrams Doctrine, there are critical capabilities built into the Guard and to the United States Reserve forces that in any large combat operation, in any major war, you have to be able to dig into the reserves in the National Guard in order to sustain combat operations. As those forces are increasingly used for other things, that really decreases U.S. readiness and their ability to meet a long-term challenge.
Thank you, Carrie, for drilling into what this will mean and what is the military currently being used for, could be used for. We have a lot of questions that go at the heart, though, of the transatlantic relationship, but I want to take us back there. And is this, Congress has expressed its desire to maintain a presence in Europe and to put reporting requirements on the Pentagon in order to keep the priorities as Europe focused as possible. Carrie, quickly to you, do you think that these reporting requirements are going to change the direction or now impact the implementation of the National Defense Strategy? And then I'll go over to Kate on Member of Congress perception.
So the biggest reporting requirement for the most part in the NDS is on the threat from Russia. The fact that the National Defense Strategy calls the threat from Russia manageable and persistent signals much more a view of Russia that is much more in line with the administration than with Congress. And so I don't know how seriously the Pentagon is going to take this reporting requirement. It'll be up to Congress in the next NDAA to determine whether or not what the Pentagon has done is satisfactory. In fact, I found the NDS's treatment of Russia versus Europe um, very condescending, right? In comparing the GDPs of Europe versus Russia, and essentially saying, Europe, you're on your own. You can defend yourself. Look at how much money you have. And divorced, in my opinion, from the reality that Europe has not invested in the defense capabilities that it needs to in order to combat a Russian modernization project that has been ongoing for over a decade, probably closer to 2 decades, including deep investment in things like hypersonic weapons and nuclear modernization and other types of things that are profoundly threatening to European allies across the continent. So, and really start to pay um, and really start to become very relevant when you're talking about the war in Ukraine and Putin's nuclear threats around Ukraine. So um, the reporting requirements are meant to force the Pentagon to continue to see Russia as a security threat. I think the NSS in particular was deeply alarming because its characterization of Russia was almost a friendly nation, or one that had been put upon by the Europeans, right? So this is not that, but it also, it's clear that the Pentagon is not going to take advantage, I don't think, of the reporting requirements and the signaling from Congress that there is support for seeing Russia as a traditional adversary, the way that we have for a very long time.
Thank you. Kate, back to you. There we have questions about the awareness of the members of Congress of the erosion of trust in the United States that is happening because of the change in policies and because of Trump's rhetoric and approach in the NDS, but on the Greenland issue. How important is this to members of Congress? How aware or concerned are they about the power of the United States and the erosion of that power with an erosion of trust in the United States as a defense actor?
I hesitate to speak for them when there are many members of Congress, vocally speaking on their perspectives, both in their committees of jurisdiction and their, from their personal offices. So take this kind of summary as a summary, and please kind of encourage everyone in our audience to follow along directly with their statements, because it is very helpful. I would say, though, at the risk of generalizing, that there's a pretty deep understanding of the damage in trust and different perspectives on whether or not that's something that can be moved through or not, or at least the risk of damage to trust. Even those that are, vocally behind the president in these policies and are looking to move forward know that there's from their perspective sort of a tightrope of trust being walked. They hope that these strategies are pushing very hard on a close ally and maybe are impolitic or even rude, but can hold the alliance, and that we will come out and allies will come out stronger on the other side. That's the articulation of that tightrope from sort of the MAGA set that is looking to put the administration's policies in play. And then from other parts of Congress, there's a real understanding of trust that is being lost and different views of how to gain it back. I think the piece that there's less understanding of, as you articulated, is the or I wouldn't say understanding, because they are members of Congress and they understand many pieces, but I don't know whether there's a wholehearted acceptance, a discussion of the loss of U.S. power in these scenarios. I think there is less discussion. It's more normative and about what should be, and a less kind of constant articulation of the ways in which U.S. security and economic power are being eroded by these decisions. And those are the sort of the scoreboard that the Trump administration cares about deeply, as well as the members of Congress. And that's the piece that's a little bit less discussed openly, even if it's a part of people's calculations.
I think that the difference, and I was just in Europe, I came back a couple of days ago, but the openness of the discussion about the fragility of their relationship, I think there is quieter awareness that I see here, but more focus perhaps on the domestic agenda in Washington, D.C. But just having been across Europe in the past few days, the literal front page headline news on this question of trust and all the languages versus the fact that this is a little bit in the background in the United States is a big difference that I think our European allies should be aware of, that the media ecosystem, that the discussion ecosystem is different right now on both sides of the Atlantic, perhaps more so than I've seen for other issues. I mean, Sophie, on this, I want to come back to you. We have a couple of minutes left, but quickly, do you think that the deprioritization of Europe is going to get a more activity from European allies on issues of security in the Arctic or more broadly? Do you think that this is a signal for more action that is going to reshape the transatlantic relationship in terms of capabilities? Because it isn't just budgets, as Carrie said. This is a budget-to-budget analysis. But you're not going to fight with a ledger in a bank or a list sheet, right? Like you're going to fight with something that you can hold in your hand. So, Sophie, what do you think? How do you anticipate this shaking out?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kristine. I mean, I think there is so much already underway, and European allies, in cooperation with the United States, have been really focusing more and investing more in Arctic and polar capabilities that are very niche, are very expensive, and that really require allies to work together, essentially, just from a scale perspective as well, and from a market and economics perspective. So I think we've been seeing a lot of that. I'm thinking it will add to the impetus, continue to add to the impetus, but I think we've been seeing a lot of it already, and so in that sense, it's maybe not so much needed. And I think it reiterates the importance of allies doing more, but we've really already been seeing a lot of that, and it just takes time to realize that. And from that perspective, I think it's damaging in some ways to air grievances loudly out in public, or to put them into strategy documents, or to threaten to take things away when capability gaps haven't been fully filled yet. But I think everyone understands in Europe, and the message has been clearly heard for a long time, that more needs to be done with regard to European defense in general, but also specifically within the Arctic. But of course, as you know well, Kristine, focusing on this issue, there's also more and more focus on how Europe can develop its own sovereign capabilities, which has also been something that the United States has emphasized for a long time, but is of course also always a difficult balance, because of course the US is also interested in driving its own defense industry. So I think we'll have to see how that plays out and how that's received by the administration.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I think I'm going to pull together a few strands that we've had over this. Oh, so please, Carrie.
Yeah, I want to finish with two very quick thoughts on the trust issue, because I think it really highlights that there's a profound arrogance to this national strategy along two lines. The first is that the United States can ignore the rest of the world beyond Western Hemisphere and Indo-Pacific, and as a part of their sort of obsession with prioritization, and that everything will be fine. It should be noted, especially with the loss of trust in European allies, what many in Korea and in Seoul might see as an abandonment, right, from around North Korea, etc. The lack of mention of other parts of the world, including South Asia, right, which is a nuclear hotbed, Africa, which has the fastest growing population in the world, the Middle East, which remains a conflict zone, etc. China and Russia will fill this void in US leadership. And they do have strategies for those regions. So the fact that the United States has essentially kind of abdicated and said, that's not part of our priority list, we're not going to pay attention to it, is profoundly, in my opinion, arrogant. The bigger one has to do with investments in defense, though, that emphasizing burden sharing. The United States is assuming, and this administration is assuming, that all of these allied investments in defense are going to be in line with US interests, and that they're going to buy American goods, and that they are going to invest in capabilities that also meet US and not just European or South Korean or Japanese interests or Filipino interests. Instead, I think we are entering an era where we're at profound risk for increased allied nuclear proliferation as US assurances are much weaker, and the nuclear umbrella and assurances that are vital to extended deterrence are much weaker, and there's much less trust by allies in the United States to uphold those commitments, as well as investments in defense capabilities that are neither American nor necessarily serve how America sees its interests abroad. And so this kind of decoupling comes with a lot of risk to both allies and the United States that I think is completely ignored in the defense strategy.
Thank you, Carrie, for pulling that together, for outlining how risky this is for the United States, not only worrying for allies around the world, but as we've said, we do not exactly know how this becomes implemented. How much of this is rhetorical, where does the line to implementation fall, and at what speed is yet to be determined. And does an awakened Congress have a greater say in the implementation and the direction of U.S. national defense strategy, not only not the homeland elements that they're currently focusing on with what is going on in Minneapolis, and the frictions that the national defense strategy outlines and actually encourages on areas such as the Arctic are likely to be an ongoing concern in the next few years as we find where the lines between rhetoric and implementation actually fall. Thank you all so much for coming and listening to our analysis here. We're available for your questions, and we have our more articulated analysis of the NDS available on the GMF website. Thank you to Louise and to Martin for making this happen, and we look forward to seeing you again next time for an understanding of what is happening on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you so much.